We'll begin. Okay. So you've all seen that we are recording this. We will just be recording the presentations, not the question and answer period. So I'm Professor Joan de Baardleven. I'm the Associate Director of the Institute of European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies, which is hosting this event. And I'd like to welcome you very much to today's very important discussion, where we'll be looking at the work of Professor Oleh Havrylyshyn and discussing it in some detail. So Professor Havrylyshyn joined EURUS as an Adjunct Research Professor in 2018. Sadly, he passed away in 2020, and this was for us too short a time to have known him, but we're gathering together today to honor his achievements and to discuss insights that his recent work offers by focusing on two of his most recent publications. These are the Palgrave Handbook of Comparative Economics, which he co-edited with Professor Elodie Douarin, who's here with us today. And in more depth, we'll be discussing the second book, which is called Present at the Transition, an inside look at the role of history, politics, and personalities in post-communist countries. This book draws not only on his extensive and deep knowledge of scholarly debates about post-communist transitions, but also on his own personal experience and knowledge as an expert and participant, actually, in some ways in those events. I want to say a bit about his career, but first on a personal note. Oleh was an active participant in EURUS events and in events of the Center for European Studies during his tenure as an adjunct research professor. Some of you may have seen him at those events. I personally was highly impressed by him in so many regards. First, the quality and quantity of his scholarly work, which you'll get a taste of today. That impression was reinforced in my recent reading of Present at the Transition, which I found to be a very complete and really insightful discussion of the topic. Second, he always made highly engaging contributions to our discussions. And I also observed that he tried to encourage and mentor young scholars, namely our students, whenever they made presentations or interventions. And one of the goals today is to continue that process. And finally, he always exhibited a kind heart and generous spirit in his personal interactions. I'm grateful I had the privilege of knowing him, however briefly, and am saddened by the loss of his presence with us. I am very pleased that Oleh's wife, Natalia, is here with us today for this event. She's just giving you a wave if you see her there. And I know she actively contributed to his work, and we are also grateful to her for her assistance with organizing today's event. So there is a more complete biography of Professor Havrylyshyn on the website, so I won't go through reading the whole thing, but I'll just mention a few highlights. He was born in Ukraine. He was a citizen of Canada. He got his Bachelor of Arts degree in economics from Queen's University here in Canada and his PhD from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He held numerous academic and visiting positions at a wide range of both North American and European universities, including, and this is not a complete list, Queen's, George Washington University, Johns Hopkins, the Geneva Institute of International Economics, and the Kyiv-Mohyla Academy in Ukraine. But his scholarly work was further enriched by numerous advisory and consultative positions with various governmental and international organizations, which is, I think, an unusual and very important fact to note because it informs his work. He served, among other things, in the Ukrainian government as Deputy Minister of Finance for International Affairs in the 1990s, as well as in other positions. Among his numerous publications, and there's a long list of them, but I just want to mention one other one that we aren't discussing in depth today, is his 2017 book called Political Economy of Ukraine Since Independence. And I think that book in particular might be of interest to some of you who are here with us today. So I'll move now to the panel. Our panel consists of three preeminent experts on post-communist transitions. We're especially pleased to have with us Professor Elodie Douarin, who is from the School of Slavonic and East European Studies at ULC London. She worked, as I mentioned, as co-editor of one of the books that we're looking at, the Palgrave Handbook of Comparative Economics. Her expertise, which I was interested to see because it's I think you're trained as an economist, correct? And so interestingly, her expertise lies in analysis of non-economic consequences of economic change and the role of values and culture in understanding economic outcomes. She'll have 15 minutes to introduce the works. Following that will be Professor Krina Vizhu-Milusevic, who is an economist, associate professor, and current director of the Institute of European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies here at Carleton. Her work is focused on economies in transition, very appropriate to this discussion, EU enlargement, and European economic integration, especially relating to trade and to agricultural policy. She'll focus more on some of the economic insights of the present at the transition book. And finally, Professor Andrea Chandler, who is a professor of political science here at Carleton. Her work and teaching covers a wide range of issues relating to the politics of transition processes in Russia and other post-communist states, with a particular focus on social welfare, gender, and identity. So each of the two of those speakers will have about 10 to 12 minutes after Professor Durand finishes. Then we should have a few minutes at the end for some questions, discussion. So if you're kind of accumulating any questions as we go along, you can put them in the chat. We'll look at them at the end, or you can, after all the presentations are done, you can raise your little electronic hand and you can ask the question orally. So I'll turn things over right away then to Professor Durand.
Thank you very much for the invitation and for this opportunity to present the Handbook of Comparative Economics. I'm going to talk mostly about that book, and I'll talk also a little bit about present at the transition. So, part of the objective of the discussion today is really to highlight Oleh's contribution to the field of transition economics. And, the two books we're going to discuss are very much illustrating this. So I just wanted to say that I'm associate professor at University College London, so UCL, School of Slavonic and East European Studies, and I've been, absolutely honored to work with Oleh on this Handbook of Comparative Economics that came out last year. And again, it's going to be the main focus of my presentation. So sorry, I can't skip slide. Oh, okay. So I'm just going to say very briefly how I met Oleh before discussing those two books. So I actually met Oleh as a student because, as you were just told, Oleh is a prominent expert in the field of transition economics and is published extensively on the topic. And I actually encountered his work as a student and always enjoyed reading his articles. And in particular, I really enjoyed this book, Divergent Paths of Post-Communist Transformation, which I thought was an extremely insightful account of the transition, an earlier attempt from Oleh to summarize the literature on the topic. And when we started working together, I was absolutely delighted to discover how warm and willing to share his knowledge he was. So working with him was an absolute honor and an absolute pleasure. So let me tell you a little bit more about the Handbook of Comparative Economics. This project was to highlight what the field of comparative economics is today. And one very important aspect of comparative economics is that the field has evolved massively over the last 30 years, and in particular because of the experience of transition. And so one of the things that we wanted to do with the handbook was to highlight how much the experience of transition was relevant to that evolution. So it's an edited book. There's 36 chapters that were contributed by different authors, and actually I can see that there's some of the authors in the room with us today. And so in total, we have 42 scholars who contributed their views of what comparative economics is today. And with Oleh, we really structured the book around the notion that following the beginning of transition, so starting from the early 1990s, comparative economics went through quite an important transformation, but remained relevant, and it remained relevant because of the lesson that we've learned from transition. So pre-1989, comparative economic studies as a field was focusing very much on comparing capitalism versus socialism versus central planning. And it was based on the notion that you had different economic systems that could be compared in terms of what outcome they were able to produce. And those economic systems were defined through different sets of dimensions. So I've taken two little boxes of text from a Handbook of Comparative Economics that was very popular at the time by Gregory and Stewart. And you can see, an economic system was defined along 5 different dimensions. And today we would describe this as bundles of institutions. And the idea was not to compare, black socialism and white capitalism, but really to recognize that all those dimensions were important and were creating a palette of different systems with different level of variation along those 5 dimensions that would then have different outcomes, and understanding which aspect, which dimension of the system was relevant to which outcome was supposed to be something that would be helpful in understanding economic development. Then 1989 arrives, and suddenly the duality between capitalism and socialism disappears. Capitalism seems to be the only model surviving beyond that point. And so the first expectation was that comparative economic system or comparative economic studies as a field would disappear. And it doesn't. Why doesn't it disappear? Because a lot of the tools and the lessons from the field were still very much relevant to the study of the transition process, and also revealed themselves as still relevant to our understanding of so economic development, but in a much broader sense, not in the sense of economic growth only, but in the sense of system survival. So what makes an economic system able to sustain itself in the long run. So from 1991 onwards, you have different other fields emerging or gaining more prominence, but most of them actually have some commonality with what comparative economic studies used to be. And so people who claim to be comparative economists today are actually producing work which falls into many different subfields. So comparative economic studies still exist. Political economy is very much a field that has been inspired or gained some insight from comparative economic studies. What's known as institutional economics or new comparative economics, which is very much focusing on the role of formal institutions, is also related to comparative economic studies. And then more recently, you've had cultural economics, new development economics, and fields like variety of capitalism and variety of economic systems that have emerged and have a line of affiliation with comparative economic studies and have benefited from the lessons that we've learned from the post-communist transition. So to reflect that evolution, we've structured the handbook into 7 parts. We're starting with part 1, which is very much describing the evolution of the field of comparative economic systems, starting from what it was prior to 1990 and following up with the changes that happen with transition. Then we have a section, part 2, comparative economic system in economic history, which reflects how the tools of comparative economic systems are useful to conduct analysis going further back in the past. Then we have section 3, which really highlights what we've learned from transition and the extent to which it has transformed the field of comparative economics. Part 4 is focusing on formal institutions and growth in the spirit of new comparative economics. Then we are broadening the goals of development in part 5. Part 6 is looking at less tangible outcomes like culture and social norms. And finally, part 7 is focusing on more methodological issues. So with all of this, we are able to cover the whole of the evolution of comparative economics in one edited volume. So I want to highlight that on top of editing the book, Oleh actually contributed 2 chapters, one in the economic history section, which is focusing on Dubrovnik, so as a leading city in medieval times, and then another chapter, chapter 11, which is on the key lessons from transition. And those 2 chapters are related to 2 other books that Oleh contributed. So the chapter on Dubrovnik is actually revisiting the evidence produced for an earlier book, Institution Always Mattered, which was already looking at the role of institution in the success of Ragusa, medieval Ragusa. And so we, in this chapter, is revisiting the evidence in a more comparative perspective. And then chapter 11 is pretty much an introduction to present at the transition. So it's presenting the key stylus facts of transition, the key lessons that can be retained from that specific experience. And to some extent, it's quite close to the first section of the book present at the transition. So in contrast to the Handbook of Comparative Economics, present at the transition is not talking about the evolution of a field, it's really focusing simply on what we've learned from the experience of transition. And it's an incredible work because it's at the cutting edge of the research in the field, and it's really summarizing everything we know on transition as of today. The other thing that is interesting in the book is that because Oleh had such a personal experience of the process, as well as a knowledge of the process from his academic work, he is able to mix different storylines. So first, build a coherent narrative on an extensive literature review, and including his own work, his own academic work on the questions, but then he's also able to add an additional layer based on his experience as a policy advisor. And so there's a lot of anecdotes that enrich and make the story more lively. And then the book is structured by going through increasing level of complexity. So part 1 is bringing the broad picture, describing the key patterns in the transition process. Part 2 is adding questions around why do we have so much divergence in the paths that are observed, and going through some of the potential explanation. Then part 3 is really trying to integrate all those messages into vicious circle, virtuous circle, to really try and explain the logic behind, again, the divergent paths that have been observed. And then section 4 opened towards more prospect for future research. And so this increasing level of complexity means that it makes very complex questions very approachable for a very broad audience. And I'm not going to say more about the book because there's 2 more speakers who are going to do exactly that. So, with this, I've covered what I wanted to say, and I'm 2 minutes early, which I guess is not bad.
That's great. Thank you very much, Elodie. That was great. And now we're going to turn to Professor Krina Wiesche-Milosevic to continue.
I will start by saying that it's an honor for me to be part of this event and to engage with Professor Havrylyshyn's research. I had the pleasure of meeting him and chatting with him many times since he started his appointment at Carleton, and he always accepted the invitation to come and talk to our students, especially that I was teaching economics in transition at the time, and the students found always his interventions extremely helpful, and they always love to have him there. So I was lucky enough to get to speak directly to him about his personal experience with the countries in transition, as he was at the time, you know, a senior official for the IMF. Coming back to the book that we are discussing today, Present to the Transition, it was a pleasure for me to read this book. As I mentioned, I taught economics of transitions for about 10 years to both undergrad and graduate levels, and to both economists and non-economists. And I find that the book is accessible to all audiences, regardless of the economics background. And also it's easy to read and engage with. It's highly comprehensive and based on a wealth of empirical evidence. In this short presentation, I'm just going to outline what are the main objectives of the book, the main findings, I'll place these findings within the larger literature on post-communist transition economics, and I will end by outlining a few contributions of this book. Hopefully I'll be able to do all that in 10 minutes. Okay. The main question of the book, which is outlined in the introduction, is, after 30 years, what do you know about the post-communist transition? So the sample of countries that the analysis is based on is quite large. It includes the Central Europe, Baltic states, Southern Eastern European countries, and former Soviet Union states. China is not used as an example, and Professor Havrylyshyn explains why, and we can go into that in the question period if you are interested in it. However, the short answer to the question posed by the book is that we see a story of divergence, as Elodie has mentioned, and it's a divergence on two layers. Divergence in terms of pace and progress of reforms, but also that divergence in terms of the economic and social indicators, the impacts of reforms. So before moving forward, I would like to outline that this is the most up-to-date book on transition economies. The most debate on this topic ran in 90s, beginning of 2000, but after the subject started to lose from its importance in the academic literature. So the advantage of having an up-to-date research is that we could observe the long-term effects of transition reforms. Thus, one of the first aims of this book is to update the stylized facts based on the long-term trends. What happened? A second aim is to provide an explanation why do we see this divergence in terms of the impacts of reforms. And the third aim is related to why there is a divergence based on the policy choice, why some countries have applied very fast reforms, which are called Big Bang, while others chose gradual reforms. And it's outlined in red here because this is the novelty of the book. This question is practically, and the approach taken to answer this question is novel. Dr. Havrylyshyn is looking at the political process by considering the role of three important forces: key individuals, mainly leaders, historical context, and external influences. So if the first two aims of the book are practically based on evidence that existed and the debate in the literature, the third one is the novelty that is brought by the book. So main findings regarding these three aims. What happened? Divergence, as I mentioned, and there are 5 facts that are agreed upon by the literature. First, all countries moved a long way from central plan regimes towards a market economy, which except with some laggards that we all know of. And it applies to democratization as well, not only to the economic transition. The second is standard of living improved markedly since the communist era. And in fact, the author criticizes the literature that compares the official GDP statistic from Soviet times to the GDP statistic of the market economics, and proposes other measures, such as look at the consumption level in these countries. It highly increased since the transition started, when we focus on necessary goods and services. A third finding is that wide divergence between best and worst performers, socioeconomic indicators, but also in terms of how fast the best performers recover from the transformational recessions. And in this grouping, Central European and Baltic states are the ones that performed the most, and they had the highest increase in the level of income, as compared with the worst performer, which are countries of the former Soviet Union space. A fourth conclusion is that a new class of rich capitalists arose in all countries. However, in the former Soviet Union states, the concentration of wealth was far greater, and we know the category of oligarchs, who in fact had important and still have important political impacts. And the last conclusion regarding the what happened question is that the divergent story in terms of corruption, it increased in former Soviet Union countries, but it declined in Central European states and Baltic states, and it's improving, continues to improve. If we move on the second question, why it happened? Why do we see this divergence? Professor Havrylyshyn has a very straight conclusion. Countries that applied fast reforms perform better in terms of socioeconomic performance, but also they have higher level of institutional development. So he clearly favors the big bang strategy and consider that big bang strategy outperforms the gradual strategy. The author acknowledges that other factors are important, but the speed is a necessary condition. And in order to support this argument, he groups the post-communist countries according to the speed of reforms and discusses their performance, with the first and second grouping on this table performing the best from the perspective of socioeconomic indicators, institutional development, and democratization. Of course, in the last section of the book, he addresses the slippage in democratic standards observed in Hungary and Poland, as they are considered to be, the best performers of transition. But he considers that this is not a unique phenomenon observed in post-communist countries. So it shouldn't be considered a reversal of transitional achievements, as it takes place in a global movement towards increased power of the right-wing parties. The third question, which is the novel part of this of the book, why did some choose rapid reforms, other gradual ones? He looks at three forces that affect the policy choice. The first is legacies of history and geography. Consider that they are important, but they have indirect effects. And what it's including here is practically thinking of the pre-communist history of Central European countries as part of Europe, as a force to return to Europe and join the European Union, while focusing on the former Soviet Union states. They had a much longer history of communism and low European orientation. However, he says this link is quite flexible. As we can see in the grouping provided in the table before, some European countries did not necessarily implement fast reforms, so to return to Europe fast, such as Romania and Bulgaria, and they prefer to have gradual reforms, as compared to other former Soviet Union states, which applied fast reforms, at least at the beginning, and later were aborted. So there is a mixed picture here. That's why history cannot have a very straightforward effect. The degree of reform commitment by leaders, and this is considered one of the most important factors that affected the choice, the policy choice. Devoted and responsible leaders, mainly the ones that substitute the old guard politicians and technocrats, were pro-rapid reforms, while self-interested leaders chose slower reforms. And of course, external influences and incentives such as EU accession and IMF and other international institution role, they are important, but the commitment of leaders to return to Europe sometime was enough without much pressure and incentive from the EU, for example, and he considered that Poland or Czech Republic and so on. So these are the three main aims of the book and the findings related to the aims. How these findings fit in the debate on the literature on economies in transition. One of the most, debated issue was the speed of reforms, Big Bang was gradualism. Here, as I mentioned before, the work of Professor Havrylyshyn clearly fits within the first category, favoring Big Bang type of reforms. And I'm not going to go into details why the literature considers one better than the other. Another debate in the literature, is the speed of reform important, or should we focus on other factors? And here I would say that even though Professor Havrylyshyn looks at other factors and how they implemented the outcomes of reforms, he considered the speed still needs to be there, it's necessary. And after we can consider other factors on top of that. So I would conclude that with some contributions of the book. First of all, it provides an updated view of the transition process in post-communist regions by using 30 years of data, offers a highly comprehensive perspective on economic transition by, as was mentioned before, combining his experience as an academic, a government official, and a senior official of the IMF during transition. It provides clear definitions, interpretations of measurements, concepts that are at the base of divergent views on transition. And lastly, adds to the economics of transition literature a novel question and empirical approach related to why countries follow different speeds of reform, by analyzing the policy process, and especially by focusing on the role of leadership, political leadership. And I will end with that, my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karina. That was a wonderful overview of the issues in the book. So now we'll turn to Professor Andrea Chandler for her contribution.
Thank you, and good afternoon. For as long as I've been teaching post-Soviet politics, I've been aware of Oleh Havrylyshyn's book. As the Soviet Union collapsed, his writings examined difficult questions about the intricate relationship between the political system and the Soviet planned economy. A key question that he raised was who was subsidizing whom in the Soviet planned economy. As nationalism emerged as a force that was contributing to the breakup of the communist system, leaders in many of the Soviet states' federal republics claimed that their territory was getting the short end of the stick, and that they would thrive economically as independent states. And as Professor Havrylyshyn observes in his 2020 book, even Russia, perhaps especially Russia, was making that claim. But the idea that the Soviet Union practiced economic imperialism, that it exploited members of the non-Russian republics, was very difficult to substantiate because of the Soviet planning system was so opaque. And so hence Professor Havrylyshyn emphasized the importance of evaluating data critically and making drawn conclusions based on data. At the same time, as this recent book demonstrates, he was very aware that political outcomes are often influenced as much by perceptions as by data. So we can see in this book the result of a career based on trying to understand how the inefficient Soviet system could be transformed into post-Soviet systems that provided economic prosperity for independent nations. This was an extremely difficult process in which he was personally involved as an economist who occupied high-ranking positions in the International Monetary Fund in the 1990s and the Ukrainian government later on. So in the present at the transition, Professor Havrylyshyn maintained a very detached analytical tone, aiming to let the data tell the story of post-communist economic development, and supplements his analysis with observations and anecdotes from his long career. And so as Professor Viju Miljusevic observed, his basic focus is with the neoliberal economic reform program known as the Big Bang approach or shock therapy. And the author argued that the countries that initiated rapid reforms early reached economic recovery the soonest and were able to deliver a sustained improvement to their citizens' standard of living. This was because citizens or leaders in countries such as Estonia were eager to escape the Soviet experience and realized that sovereignty required a sustainable economy. By contrast, countries that did not complete neoliberal reforms remained in severe economic straits longer, with more pain to their populations. Where reform was avoided, this occurred for political reasons. As members of the former Soviet elite were keen to hold on to their power and privileges, and they took advantage of their own personal proximity to economic resources in order to take advantage of a weak state on the one hand and a population struggling to get by on the other. Professor Havrylyshyn was not the first to argue that political factors undermined reform in countries such as Russia, but one of the things that I appreciated most about this work was his ability to communicate in fine detail how oligarchs and former nomenklatura not only wanted to gain wealth and increase their own power, but how they sought to maintain power over others by preventing a diversification of the economy, in effect acting as gatekeepers. His description of how corruption worked at the micro level was fascinating. And it really explained how the odds are stacked against the small entrepreneur who wants to get ahead. Another theme that for me was really illuminating was his discussion of the role that international institutions played in shaping the reform process in post-communist countries. These institutions included the IMF and World Bank, as well as the European Union and the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. In the mid to late 1990s, the notion that these institutions were Western dominated took root, became part of the political discourse in countries such as Russia, and opposition parties on the far left and far right in Russia argued that international institutions were seeking to impose hurtful policies on Russia. This narrative, I would say, helped Putin to get to power. And for a long time, the role of international institutions and the relationship between the West and countries such as Russia or Ukraine became a very heated subject of debate between Western scholars and scholars in the region. But there's still not a whole lot of scholarly literature on the actual roles that these institutions played in politics. So this is where Professor Havrylyshyn made a very valuable contribution. Among the observations that are really important are, for example, he tells us that there was never really a one-size-fits-all template for the post-communist countries to follow. Instead, reform advice was worked out in dialogue with leaders, considering their particular conditions. Another observation is that many of the post-Soviet leaders, and more importantly, their civil servants, had very little formal knowledge of how a capitalist economy works and of the impact and intricate relationships between financial, monetary, and trade policies. Therefore, Havrylyshyn emphasized that a key role that international institutions played was in training and building of practical skills and knowledge among policymakers and economic policy officials. Havrylyshyn also argued that international institutions were just as often advising reformers in the countries in the field to slow down, or at least to move more methodically, rather than to accelerate the reform, as is kind of often conventionally argued. And of course, a key to the economic development of the non-Russian countries has been the choices to build relationships with neighboring countries and associations. And so this is a subject of discussion in the book as well. For the Baltic countries, the European Union, and especially Scandinavian countries, have been key partners in the process of securing independence. For Azerbaijan, it has been Turkey. For Central Asian countries with natural resource, well, they have a number of global interactions with various partners. So another important theme in the book, I thought, was the discussion of the legacy of the Russian and Soviet empires, which continues to loom over the entire region. As Professor Havrylyshyn argued, Russia sought to use economic levers, especially oil and gas subsidies or pipelines, in order to maintain political influence. But the author argues that this strategy doesn't always work. The less reliable or trustworthy Russia is seen as a partner, the more neighboring countries seek their distance. Ukraine in 2014, after the annexation of Crimea, is the obvious example of this phenomenon. However, according to Havrylyshyn, when economic pressure fails, Russia may resort to outright force. So this is especially ominous for Ukraine and the Baltic states, and indeed for all of Europe. But the point is that President Putin's imperial mentality mentally obstructs Russia's own economic prosperity. And this is an important point that the author makes. If I may, I'd like to comment briefly on another argument in the book, which is the notion that the data suggests that on the whole, post-Soviet citizens are better off than they were during communist times, and that their living standards improved much sooner than they realized. I bring this point up because another very recent book makes quite a different argument. This is Kristen Godsey and Mitchell Orenstein's work, Taking Stock of Shock, Social Consequences of the 1989 Revolution, published by Oxford University Press this year in 2021. So I think that Professor Havrylyshyn's book makes these arguments based on overall indicators of improvements in standard of living, whereas Godsey and Orenstein are focusing on the groups which have struggled to compete in the new post-Soviet reality. The older generation, the miners and traditional manufacturing workers, people in rural areas, single mothers, to name a few. And scholars who focus on the social impact of the transition consider changes in household income, but also consider factors such as disparities in economic opportunities and support, the role that ethnic discrimination plays in the process of trying to gain a livelihood, for example, for minorities such as Roma, the safety nets that are available to the disabled and chronically ill, and the availability of affordable childcare and reproductive health services. If people have enough bread on the table today, that's very important, but it will not necessarily make people satisfied with life if they feel insecure about what is coming tomorrow. And so I think, as Godsey and Orenstein observed, the word shock does not only describe rapid economic reforms, but also a state of mind, a stunning blow of this dramatic transition that took place with the overturning of a longstanding state ideology, and that shock may impact those who remember the 1990s for their entire lives. And that shock will color their perceptions of what their social and economic experience is. And the political fallout from this sense of shock that citizens experience will probably keep scholars in my discipline of political science busy for many years to come. That said, I really learned a lot from this ambitious book. It provides an overview of almost 30 years of the post-communist transition, and really captures its complexity very clearly. And it was a real pleasure to read this book, and I'm sure I'll be referring it again and again in my teaching for years to come. And thanks for the opportunity to be here with you.
Thank you very much, Andrea. I think those were very interesting comments that reflected, not only recounted what Professor Havrylyshyn was trying to do in the book, but also put some perspective in terms of some of the other literature. So thank you for that. So now we have a bit of time